Anyway, I'm William O'Rourke in the English department. And I've been in the English department for a long time, but not as long as John Matthias was in the English department. Since he was here when I got here in 1981, wet behind the ears, or I suppose I was wet behind. I might have been dry behind the ears, I don't really recall. But John was here, and he retired. We couldn't nail down a precise date, but it was either 6 or 7 years ago, though he remained the poetry editor of the Notre Dame Review till 2012. And I am, as they used to say, I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, in the sense that I am going to retire at the end of this academic year. And John has made retirement seem like the right thing to do. Because since he's retired, there's been a deluge of books appearing. Many. It's not that I couldn't count the number, but, you know, a lot has appeared since he retired. In the front of the novel he's going to read from this evening is, you know, a list of also, and the also, you know, endless books of poetry starting in 1970, and then the collected poems have been coming out 2011, 12, and the last one came out in 13. There's translations, there's essays, Who Was Cousin Alice, which is, I think, down there, came out in 2011 also. And then there's editions, a number of editions he did. If there's another book to follow, it will have to have a section of fiction, meaning this novel. John has been in a number of ways a role model for me, insofar as sort of a counter role model, because I would see myself coming up short in a number of ways. John is extremely well-read, whereas I'm very spottily well-read. He liked jazz, opera, classical music. I, of course, like all of that too, but I can't name every sonata I hear. I can't name every movement I listen to. There's any number of things in terms of jazz, which I enjoy. A lot of those names escape me, but they don't escape John. So our backgrounds are somewhat different. But when I got here, I looked around. This was in '81. And I said, well, what this university needs is a graduate creative writing program. So I went around to John Matthias and Sonia Gurnes and said, what this university needs is a graduate creative writing program. And they both looked at me, knowing what I was asking of them, since they were the other two writers on staff. I was asking for them to do more work. Well, it took a while. I had to get tenure before I could throw any weight around. But John and Sonia were instrumental in establishing our creative writing program here at the university. So all of this, or a great deal of it, you know, would not exist without them. John, of course, was also, for many years, the co-editor of the Notre Dame Review, and as I said earlier, the poetry editor till 2012. He still has his hand in, insofar he's now editor at large, so he continues to write for and bring us work. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of the Notre Dame Review, and it's now close to 20 years existence, is we probably cover poetry in our review sections as well, if not better, than any other mixed genre publication. And most all of that is in tribute to John, insofar as he was the one who's pulled that off. Now, with this novel, John has sort of entered the labyrinth, or the La Brea tar pit, whichever way you want to look at it, of the kind of modern controversies over fiction and nonfiction and how they bleed into one another. It's one of the strange things that John's written a lot of nonfiction throughout his entire life. Some young writers think they've just discovered this fact, but most American poetry is nonfiction. In fact, back in the old days, in the 60s and the 70s, Publishers Weekly, when it was a more inclusive trade publication, always reviewed, all the poetry books were reviewed in the nonfiction category. I say some young writers think they've just discovered this fact. But it's, I suppose, the last 20 years, the ascendancy of the memoir, and in many cases the ersatz memoir, which is sort of added to the blend of what is fiction and what is nonfiction. So, this particular novel is not afraid to, mix it up with that. But at the same time, people who make use of one's life and others' lives, it's in some ways, I always see it as a tribute to think other people's lives are important enough to memorialize in the pages of fiction. In this case, I hope you all read it and you'll find out yourself. But the last long chapter, I suppose we would call it, it's called Westmont as Talbot Eastmore, is a kind of fascinating reprise of the earlier part of the novel, insofar as it declares that the narrator is actually somebody else, and that somebody else is this person who then tells a great deal of his life. The oddity of that is that tradition is very old. It goes back to Hawthorne's, the Scarlet Letter, which begins with the Custom House section, and in more modern times, Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse, but has the same thing. It starts with a nonfiction section. In this case, seemingly, there's an echo of that, but it's put at the end of the novel, not at the beginning. But that, too, is a derivation insofar as it's not quite what it seems. Fiction isn't. And the difficulty with fiction, which isn't difficult with life, and John has surmounted the difficulty, but when you're writing when you're creating an imaginary world, it's really difficult to keep the continuity within the imaginary. Because if you're making it up, it still has to make sense. And that leads to the oddity that you have to keep a novel in your head as you're writing it. And it's very difficult sometimes to keep 200, 300, 400 pages in your head. Anyway, you'll see for yourself when he reads. Let me end with just saying that, of course, South Bend plays a role in this novel, not necessarily the role that might seem to be obvious, but I did notice, sort of in the middle of it, a Studebaker lark makes an appearance. And that must have something to do with South Bend. Here's John.